The frantic, high-pitched wail of the arterial line monitor sliced through the sterile air of War 1. A geyser of crimson erupted from the patient's chest, painting the sterile drapes a horrifying shade of failure. Dr. Julian Croft, his face a mask of fury behind his surgical loops, fought the bleed with a surgeon's desperate violence. More suction. I can't see the tear, he roared. Nurse Anya Sharma, quiet and new, anticipated his need, offering a fresh DeBakey clamp. Croft snatched it, then shoved it back towards her tray without a glance. Useless. Just keep the field clear and stay out of my sightline. The dismissal was a physical blow, meant to sting. As the patient's heart rhythm devolved into a useless flutter on the monitor, Croft's godlike confidence shattered. We're losing him. Amid the panic, Anya stood preternaturally still. Her eyes weren't on Croft's failing sutures, but on the subtle, damning pressure building deep in the patient's retroperitoneum. A problem no instrument on the tray could reach. A problem she had seen before, not in a pristine hospital, but in the dust and chaos of war. And she knew exactly how to stop it. Her first day at Prestige General had been an exercise in clinical vertigo. Just 3 weeks prior, her operating room had been a canvas tent where the percussive rhythm of a diesel generator and distant artillery fire was the only cardiac monitor you could trust. The air, thick with the coppery scent of blood and the fine grit of desert sand, was a constant reminder of the razor-thin margin between life and death. Here, the air was filtered, chilled, and smelled of nothing but antiseptic and ambition. The corridors of the cardiothoracic wing were wide and hushed, the floors polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the recessed LED lighting that glowed with the cold, blue-white light of a star. This wasn't a hospital, it was a temple dedicated to the gods of modern medicine, and its high priest was Dr. Julian Croft. Anya met him for the first time during the preoperative briefing for the aortic transection case. She stood at the back of the glass-walled conference room, a sterile space dominated by an 8K monitor displaying a breathtakingly detailed, three-dimensional reconstruction of the patient's damaged aorta. Croft stood before it like a conductor before his orchestra, a sleek silver pointer his baton. He wasn't a large man, but his presence consumed the room's oxygen. His surgical scrubs were tailored, his salt and pepper hair was perfect, and he exuded an aura of such profound self-assurance that it bordered on a physical force. The tear is clean, just distal to the subclavian artery, Croft announced, his voice smooth and resonant. He traced a line on the holographic image. The O-arm will give us a perfect intraoperative view. We'll go in, resect the damaged segment, and place an 18mm Dacron graft. Minimal cross-clamp time. We'll have him in the CVICU before lunch. He was a master of the technological lexicon. He spoke of endovascular robotics, computational fluid dynamics, and catheter-based imaging systems with the casual fluency of a poet. His residence, a collection of bright, eager, sleep-deprived faces, hung on his every syllable, their adulation palpable. The charge nurse, a stern woman named Brenda, had introduced Anya just before the briefing began. Dr. Croft, this is our new senior nurse, Anya Sharma. Croft had given her a glance that lasted no longer than a single heartbeat. It was a scan, an assessment not of a person but of a component. He noted her new scrubs, her unremarkable posture, and his eyes dismissed her. Sharma. Right. You're from, where was it? St. Jude's General, Anya replied, omitting the 2 years of active combat duty that had preceded it. It never looked good on a resume, it made administrators nervous. Right. A community hospital, Croft said, the words dripping with faint condescension. Welcome to the major leagues. Brenda, make sure she knows where the suture carts are. I'm particular about my prolanes. He turned his back on her, the dismissal absolute. It was a classic power play, assign a menial task, establish the hierarchy. Anya was a tool, and a generic one at that. She spent the briefing in silence, observing. While Croft mesmerized his acolytes with technological wizardry, Anya's eyes were drawn to the raw data, the grayscale slices of the CT angiogram scrolling in a smaller window. Her mind, trained to find the subtle tells of catastrophic injury in low-fidelity environments, filtered out the noise. And she saw it. It was a tiny detail, a ghost on the image that the 3D reconstruction algorithm had smoothed over. On slice 147, near the proximal edge of the planned clamp site, was a whisper of a shadow. A small, calcified plaque, with what looked like a minute intimal flap peeling away from the aortic wall. It was the kind of atherosclerotic lesion that made the vessel wall brittle, like old parchment. To a surgeon relying on a perfect digital model, it was invisible. To a nurse who had seen aortas shredded by shrapnel, it was a blinking red light. Clamping down on that spot, putting a suture line through it, was like trying to sew rotten fabric. It wouldn't hold. She felt a cold prickle of dread. She waited for a pause in Croft's sermon, a moment to interject. The opportunity came when a junior resident asked a question about clamp placement. "Excuse me, doctor," Anya said, her voice quiet but clear. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, a mix of surprise and irritation. "You did not interrupt the high priest." Croft turned slowly, his eyebrows raised in a perfect arch of annoyance. "Yes, Nurse Sharma? Do you need help finding the 4-0 proline?" A few of the residents snickered. Anya felt a flush of heat creep up her neck, but she held his gaze. "On the axial CTA, sir. Slice 147. There appears to be a calcified plaque at the proximal landing zone. The tissue integrity could be compromised." The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Croft walked slowly to the monitor, feigning a deep interest in the image she had indicated. He squinted for a moment, then let out a soft, dismissive sigh. "An artifact," he declared to the room, not to her. "A bit of image noise. Our systems are calibrated to filter such things out of the primary model for a reason, to avoid being distracted by clinical phantoms." He turned his devastatingly charming, utterly belittling smile on her. An understandable rookie observation. But here at Prestige, we trust the $500 million imaging suite over a hunch. We deal in data, not daydreams. He looked away, the trial and execution complete. "Now, as I was saying, the clamp will be placed precisely here." He tapped the 3D model, right on the spot Anya had warned him about. The humiliation was a physical weight. She saw Brenda give her a sharp, warning shake of the head. Asterisk, you don't challenge him. Ever, asterisk, Anya retreated back into the shadows of the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't just being ignored, her expertise, hard-won in blood and chaos, had been recategorized as naive foolishness. She watched him, so brilliant, so confident, so completely and utterly blind. He was walking into or one armed with the best technology money could buy, but he was missing the most important instrument of all, the instinct to recognize that beneath the pristine digital surfaces, flesh and blood remained treacherously, unpredictably fragile. And Anya knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the artifact on slice 147 was no phantom. It was a landmine, and Dr. Croft was about to step directly on it. The operating theater was Croft's cathedral, and for the first 90 minutes, the service was flawless. The air, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, hummed with the quiet confidence of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Croft was the conductor. His scalpel moved with an artist's grace, his commands to the residents flanking him were sharp, didactic, and laced with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known failure. "Note the angle of the graft, Dr. Evans," he said, not looking up from the intricate lattice of sutures he was laying down. "Perfection isn't an aspiration, it's the baseline." Anya, positioned near the perfusionist, remained a ghost. She anticipated every need, her hands moving with quiet efficiency, passing instruments to Brenda before they were even requested. She watched the arterial line waveform on the monitor, a jagged, rhythmic mountain range that told the true story of the patient's state. It was steady. For now. Croft placed the final suture on the primary repair of the aortic transection. He leaned back, a flicker of a self-satisfied smile playing on the lips visible above his mask. There. A textbook repair. The artifact on the scan was, as I predicted, a digital ghost. He gestured for irrigation. "Let's begin to close." It was then that Anya saw it. A subtle dip in the arterial waveform, a slight flattening of its peaks. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Chen, noticed it too. Pressure's a little soft, Julian. 90/60. He's been open a while, Kenji. Give him a little pressor, Croft said dismissively, already thinking about his post-op dictation. He's already getting it, Chen replied, his voice a notch tighter. Heart rate is climbing. 120. 130. Anya's eyes were locked on the suction canister. The clear plastic container, which had been slowly collecting a pale pink fluid, was suddenly swirling with arterial red. Bright, furious red. Dr. Croft, she said, her voice low but clear. He ignored her. Brenda, 1-0 proline for the fascia. Sir, Anya insisted, stepping forward. Look at the suction. And then all hell broke loose. The monitor above the patient's head shrieked, a single, piercing alarm that cut through the room's sterile calm. The arterial line tracing nosedived. On the surgical field, a wellspring of crimson blossomed from beneath Croft's perfect suture line. The repair hadn't just leaked, it had catastrophically failed. The landmine had detonated. Damn it! Croft roared, lunging forward. Lapse. More suction. Give me a DeBakey clamp. Chaos erupted. Residents fumbled for laparotomy pads, stuffing them into the growing pool of blood. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was drowned out by the gurgle of the high-powered suction fighting a losing battle. The clean, organized surgical field vanished, replaced by a churning, obscured vortex of red. Croft's hands, moments before the instruments of a god, were now grappling blindly in the patient's chest. I can't see the tear. It's retracted behind the peritoneum. He finally got the long, curved DeBakey clamp into the abyss, trying to blindly grasp the source of the hemorrhage. The metal jaws closed on what he hoped was the aorta. For a second, the torrent slowed. Got it, he grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. But the tissue was too friable, too traumatized. The serrated clamp, designed for control, slipped off the slick, blood-covered vessel. The bleeding returned with a vengeance, even worse than before. The force of the hemorrhage had now fully torn the vessel loose from its fragile mooring. It's no good. The tissue is like wet paper, he snarled, throwing the useless clamp onto the tray with a clatter. Bovie. I'll try to cauterize the bleeders. Brenda slapped the electrocautery tool into his hand. He plunged it into the wound. The air filled with the sickening sweet smell of burning tissue, a plume of steam hissing up from the bloody deluge. But it was like trying to put out a fire with a single drop of water. The blood simply washed over the cauterized points, finding new pathways to escape. BP is 60/30 and dropping. Chen yelled. He's in VTACH. I'm starting massive transfusion protocol. The red bags of packed cells were now being squeezed by hand into the patient's 4 lines, a desperate, futile attempt to refill a bucket with a hole the size of a fist. Anya watched Croft's movements become frantic, his godlike confidence shattering into a million pieces of raw panic. He was no longer a surgeon, he was a man drowning, flailing against the tide of his own making. The bleed was retroperitoneal. Anya knew what that meant from the field. It was the surgeon's black box, a void behind the abdominal organs where a man could bleed his entire volume into himself in minutes without a single drop hitting the floor. There were no landmarks, no easy planes to dissect. It was a blind, bloody guessing game. I can't get control, Croft whispered, the words a raw admission of defeat. His shoulders slumped. The sterile blue drapes were stained a deep, horrifying black-red. His gloves, his gown, the floor beneath his feet, all were awash in failure. He looked at the junior residents, their faces pale with terror behind their masks, and saw his own impotence reflected back at him. All the technology, the 3D scans, the multi-million-dollar hybrid ore, none of it mattered. They were back in the Dark Ages, fighting a primal enemy with hands that were no longer enough. Anya stood in her corner, a pillar of stillness in the swirling storm. The scene was horrifyingly familiar. The smell of blood, the sound of panicked shouting, the frantic, useless motions of men out of their depth. She'd seen it a dozen times before in a canvas tent under mortar fire, with half the equipment and twice the courage. She knew exactly what to do. The hierarchy, the rules, Croft's monumental ego, they were all luxuries of a world that no longer existed inside or won. Here, there was only the patient, the bleed, and the ticking clock. And the clock was about to run out. The shrill, unbroken tone of the long QT alarm cut through the chaos like a blade. Flatline. Every eye snapped to the monitor, where a single, merciless green line stretched across the screen. Damn it! Croft roared, his control finally fracturing. He hurled a blood-soaked laparotomy pad into a basin with a sickening slap. This is hopeless. The aorta's inaccessible. He dropped his forceps onto the tray with a clatter of finality, his voice raw and defeated. Call it. Time of death. Is this where the story ends? Where arrogance and hierarchy declare victory over a life? We've all been in situations where the expert gives up, where the underdog is told to stand down. If you believe the quietest person in the room deserves a chance to change the game, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss what happens when true expertise finally speaks up. The high, unwavering tone of the asystole alarm sliced through the operating room, a sterile shriek that announced the end of all effort. It was the sound of finality, the electronic eulogy for a life that had just spilled onto the floor. For a moment, the frantic ballet of surgery ceased. Residents froze, forceps in hand. The scrub nurse stared at her instrument tray as if the tools had betrayed her. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Evans, slowly shook his head, his hand hovering over the ventilator controls, a gesture of surrender. Dr. Julian Croft ripped his bloody gloves off and threw them onto the drapes covering the patient's legs. The slap of latex was a gunshot in the funereal silence. This is hopeless, he spat, the words scraping his throat. The godlike certainty that had defined his entire career had evaporated, leaving behind the acrid residue of failure. He turned away from the table, from the cavernous, blood-filled wound he could not master. Call it, he ordered, his voice hollow. Time of death. No. The word was not loud, but it cut through the drone of the monitor and the suffocating despair with the precision of a number 10 scalpel. It was a blade of steel in a room full of frayed nerves. Every head turned. Anya Sharma stepped out of the periphery. She was no longer the quiet, unassuming nurse who fetched supplies and anticipated needs from the shadows. The meekness had been stripped away, replaced by an unyielding, almost unnerving calm. Her brown eyes, usually downcast and deferential, were now fixed on Croft, burning with an intensity that made the celebrated surgeon take an involuntary step back. Not on my watch, she said again, her voice level and absolute. She moved toward the instrument table, her steps deliberate, economical. She was a different person, remade by the crisis. Circulator, get me a 24 French Foley catheter kit. And a 60 cubic centimeters syringe. Now. The circulating nurse, a veteran named Maria, just stared, her mouth agape. A Foley? For what? His bladder is fine. Croft found his voice, a low growl of disbelief and rage. Nurse, have you lost your mind? We are past catheters. The man is dead. Now stand down before I have you thrown out of this hospital. Anya didn't even flinch. She met his furious gaze without a flicker of fear. He's not dead until his brain is starved of oxygen, doctor. Right now, he's just empty. We have maybe 2 minutes to fix that. She turned back to the dumbfounded circulator. The Foley. Now. Her tone left no room for debate. It wasn't a request, it was a battlefield command. Galvanized by her certainty, Maria rushed to the supply cabinet. Croft advanced on Anya, his face a mask of thunder. I am the head of this department, Sharma. You are a junior nurse. You will not countermand my order in my OR. What in God's name do you think you're going to do with a urinary catheter against a transected aorta? The same thing I did for a corporal with a femoral artery shredded by an IED, she stated, her voice dropping, each word a piece of a history he couldn't possibly comprehend. and for a gunnery sergeant with a subclavian bleed from a piece of shrapnel. I was a forward surgical team nurse, 3rd Battalion, Kandahar Province. We didn't have robotic arms or bioglue. We had pressure, prayer, and improvisation. She turned to face him fully, her slight frame seeming to radiate an authority that dwarfed his own. Your problem isn't the tear itself. It's that you can't reach it to clamp it. It's a busted fire hydrant behind a brick wall. All your tools are useless because you can't see the source. But you don't need to see it. Maria slapped the sterile Foley kit onto the scrub table. Anya tore it open with practiced efficiency, her hand steady as rock. You're going to use blunt occlusion, she continued, her focus now entirely on her task. We're going to thread this catheter into the tear by feel. Once it's past the lesion, we'll inflate the balloon with saline. It will expand and act as an internal plug, a tamponade. It will stop the hemorrhage long enough for you to get proximal and distal control and actually repair the vessel. The residents and the scrub tech were staring, utterly mesmerized. It was an idea so brutally simple, so outside the realm of their high-tech training, that it bordered on genius or insanity. Croft's mind reeled, processing the insane logic of her plan. A balloon tamponade. It was a crude, barbaric technique, something from a MASH unit, not a billion-dollar surgical suite. It was also the only new idea that had been presented in the room. He looked at the flat line on the monitor, the unceasing alarm a monument to his own failure. He looked at this quiet nurse, who was now calmly drawing 60 ccs of sterile saline into a syringe, her movements clean and certain. She held a terrifying, last-ditch hope in her hands. His pride, his reputation, his entire sense of order screamed at him to shut her down. But the surgeon inside him, the part that existed before the fame and the ego, saw the flicker of a chance. A 1 in a million chance, but it was more than the 0 he currently had. The anesthesiologist caught his eye, his expression pleading. "Julian, what have we got to lose?" The words died in Croft's throat. He was beaten. He nodded, a single, sharp, almost violent motion. The decision was made. He turned to the team, his voice a low bark, devoid of its usual arrogance, replaced by raw desperation. "Get her what she needs. Move." The spell was broken. The room exploded back into motion, but this time, the chaos had a new center of gravity. It was Anya. "Scrub tech, long DeBakey forceps," she commanded, not looking up. "I'll need them to guide the tip. Anesthesia, start priming 2 more units of Oneg. The second we have tamponade, I want you to slam them in. Let's get some volume back. Someone get the ultrasound in here. We'll use it to confirm balloon placement if we can, but we're going in blind first." She held up the catheter, its thick, orange-colored silicone tip a stark contrast to the gleaming, delicate instruments on the tray. It was a tool of plumbing, not surgery. And it was their last hope. She walked to the operating table, to the space Croft had just abandoned, and looked at him. There was no triumph in her eyes, only an urgent, shared purpose. "Doctor," she said, her voice now quiet but resonant with authority. "I can't do this." "You can. I'll guide you. You know the anatomy better than anyone. Put your gloves back on." For a long, silent moment, Julian Croft stood frozen, a statue of surgical steel and shattered pride. The world had inverted. The chain of command, the very laws of physics that governed his universe, had been torn asunder. His hands, which had performed miracles, had failed. And now, the voice telling him to pick up his tools again belonged not to a senior attending or a revered consultant, but to the quiet, mousy nurse from the morning briefing. Anya's voice, devoid of accusation, was what finally broke his paralysis. It was the voice of a peer, a partner in a desperate act. He looked from her unflinching gaze to his own hands, red-stained and useless. Then he looked at the patient, a life represented by a single, unwavering line on the monitor. Hopeless. He had said it himself. But her words, not on my watch, echoed in the vacuum of his certainty. Without a word, he turned back to the table. The scrub nurse, her eyes wide as dinner plates, held out a fresh pair of sterile gloves. The snap of the latex as he pulled them on was like the cocking of a gun. The sound cut through the hushed awe of the room. He was no longer Dr. Croft, the god of War I. He was an instrument, and Anya Sharma was the surgeon. Retractors, Anya said, her voice a low, steady hum that anchored the room. Dr. Evans, I need you to pull the descending colon and the root of the mesentery medially. We need to expose the retroperitoneum as much as possible. Suction, right at Dr. Croft's hands. Keep the field clear. The junior surgeon, Evans, jumped to comply, his movements jerky with adrenaline. Suction gurgled, clearing a temporary well in the lake of dark, non-clotting blood. Doctor, Anya focused on Croft. Your left hand. I need you to palpate the aorta, just distal to the subclavian artery takeoff. Ignore the hematoma. Forget what you see. Feel. Croft plunged his hand into the warm, slick abyss of the patient's chest cavity. His fingers, trained to read tissue like Braille, navigated the chaotic landscape of traumatized organs. He felt the spongy mass of the hematoma, the pressure of pooled blood. Then, beneath it all, he felt it, the faint, thready ghost of a pulse. The aorta. The great vessel was a bucking, wounded animal. I have it, he rasped, his own throat dry. Good, Anya said, her tone as calm as if she were guiding him through a routine dressing change. Now, trace it down. The tear is posterior. You won't see it, but you will feel it. The bleed is coming from the descending segment. Move your fingertips along the vessel wall. There will be a disruption in the smooth muscle. A defect. More importantly, you'll feel a jet. A jet? Evans mumbled from across the table. A thrill, Anya corrected without looking at him. A high-frequency vibration from the blood escaping under pressure. It'll feel like a purr, a buzz right under your skin. Find that vibration, doctor. Croft closed his eyes, shutting out the useless visual information. He was flying blind, his entire multi-million-dollar education, his years of celebrated skill, reduced to the raw, primal sense of touch. He let his fingers dance over the vessel, pressing gently. The tissue felt edematous, boggy, wrong. Seconds stretched into an eternity, each one measured in the gurgle of the suction and the damning silence of the EKG. He felt nothing. I can't. He started, frustration and failure rising like bile. You can, Anya's voice cut in, sharp and certain. It's there. The patient's pressure is non-existent, so the jet will be weak. Be sensitive. Think of it as a whisper, not a shout. It's there. He took a breath, cleared his mind, and tried again. He let his ego fall away, let the desperation fuel his focus. He was just a man with his hands inside another man, trying to find a single, fatal flaw. And then, he felt it. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. A tiny, high-pitched hum against the pad of his index finger. A vibration of death. I have it, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. A ripple of astonishment went through the room. Hold that position, Anya commanded, now at his elbow. She held out the long DeBakey forceps. Take these in your right hand. I need you to pass them along your left index finger, using it as a guide. Gently dissect a path through the hematoma directly towards that thrill. He took the instrument. It felt familiar, an extension of his own will. He followed her instruction, the metal tips parting the clotted blood, moving millimeter by millimeter towards the source of the vibration. He was a bomb disposal expert, following instructions from an unseen commander to defuse a device he couldn't see. Stop, Anya said. He froze. You're at the aortic wall. She was now holding the Foley catheter, its tip coated in lubricating gel. She placed the end of it into his waiting hand, between his thumb and forefinger. It felt absurdly crude, a length of rubber plumbing amidst the finely machined elegance of his surgical tools. Now the catheter, she said. The DeBakeys have made a channel for you. Advance the tip through that channel. Slow and steady. You're aiming for the defect your other hand is feeling. Let the thrill guide you in. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was madness. He was about to intentionally insert a urinary catheter into a transected aorta, guided by a nurse who hadn't been at this hospital for more than a month. He could feel the eyes of his entire team on him, witnessing either a miracle or an act of profound malpractice. He pushed the skepticism down. He had no other path. He began to advance the catheter. The silicone tube slid sluggishly through the coagulum. He felt for the aortic wall with the tip. "You'll feel a slight give," Anya murmured, her voice directly beside his ear now, a private channel in the chaos. "A loss of resistance. The vessel wall is torn. You're not pushing through muscle, you're slipping through a hole. Find the hole, doctor." He nudged the tip forward, probing. Nothing. He adjusted the angle, his left index finger a constant beacon on the source of the thrill. He advanced again. For a terrifying second, he felt resistance and feared he was about to perforate the healthy vessel wall. He pulled back a fraction. And then, it happened. The tip of the catheter, which had been pressing against tissue, suddenly slid forward into open space. There was no resistance, just a sudden, smooth, unmistakable give. It felt like stepping through a doorway in the dark. He had entered the lumen of the aorta. He was in. He held his breath. The entire room seemed to hold its breath with him. He could feel the faint, dying pulse of the great artery around the thin tube he now held pinched between his fingers. "Hold it right there, doctor," Anya's voice was tight with focused intensity. "You're in. Don't move." He was in. The thought was a flare of adrenaline in the fog of his exhaustion. For a split second, Croft's training screamed at him, "You've just passed a foreign object into the single most critical vessel in the human body, blind star." But a deeper, more primal instinct, guided by the impossible calm in Anya's voice, held him steady. His gloved fingertips were the only thing connecting him to the patient's last chance. "Hold it right there, doctor," Anya's voice was tight with focused intensity. "You're in. Don't move." She didn't look at Croft. Her eyes were locked on the scrub nurse. "Claire, give me a 30 cubic centimeters syringe with sterile saline. Now." Claire, a veteran nurse who had seen Croft perform surgical miracles and throw instruments in equal measure, moved without question. Her hands, usually a blur of efficient motion, were now deliberate, almost reverent. She drew up the saline, checked for air bubbles, and approached the inflation port of the Foley catheter, a tiny, Lurlock valve sticking out from the end that Croft held. The monotonous, soul-crushing beep of the flat line continued to drone from the monitor, a funeral dirge for their failure. "Dr. Croft," Anya said, her tone shifting from command to precise instruction. "When she inflates, the balloon will expand. I need you to pull back on the catheter with gentle, steady traction. You're not yanking it, you're seating it. Feel for the back wall of the aorta. Let the balloon find the hole and plug it from the inside. Understand?" He gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes fixed on the bloody chasm in the patient's abdomen. He could see nothing. This entire maneuver was being performed in a world of tactile sensation, a universe defined by the millimeters of plastic in his hand. "Claire, connect and push," Anya ordered. Claire connected the syringe. Her thumb pressed down on the plunger. Deep within the patient's retroperitoneum, a spacecraft could no longer see, a miracle of physics was occurring. The silicone balloon at the tip of the catheter, no bigger than a pea, began to swell as saline was forced into it. It expanded smoothly, powerfully, displacing the blood around it. Croft felt it instantly. The thin catheter in his hand grew tense, a subtle vibration traveling up its length as the balloon filled. "Pull back," Anya's voice was a whisper in his ear now, intimate and urgent. "Gently." He drew the catheter back. 1 centimeter. 2. He felt the soft resistance of tissue, and then, a distinct, solid thump. The inflated balloon had caught on the ragged edges of the aortic tear. He had seated it. He was plugging the leak from the inside out, just as she'd said. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The first thing to change was the sound. The high-pitched, desperate shriek of the surgical suction, which had been working non-stop to clear a torrential flood of blood, suddenly dropped in pitch. The gurgling stopped. It became a low, intermittent hiss, clearing the last of the pooled blood from the cavity. The wellspring of the hemorrhage had been capped. The second change was visual. The surgical field, which minutes before had been an incomprehensible soup of red, began to clear. As the suction caught up, anatomical landmarks, the curve of the kidney, the glistening sheath of the psoas muscle, emerged from the carnage. The frantic swapping of blood-soaked lap pads ceased. Then came the miracle on the monitor. The solid, unbroken tone of the flat line wavered. For a second, a flicker of artifact. Then, a single, jagged, beautiful QRS complex slashed across the screen. It was weak, wide, and ugly, the protest of a heart that had been starved of blood, but it was a beat. A collective gasp went through the room, a sharp intake of air from a dozen people who had forgotten how to breathe. "We have a rhythm," the anesthesiologist, Dr. Evans, said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "V-tach." "No, wait. Sinus tach. I have a heartbeat." Another complex appeared on the screen. And another. Faint, but growing stronger. The beep was replaced by the slow, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a returning pulse. "Art lines coming up," Evans called out, his voice gaining strength. "Pressure is 45/20. It's garbage, but it's there. Give me 2 more units of packed cells and 2 of FFP, wide open." The room, which had been frozen in a tableau of despair, exploded back into controlled, purposeful action. Nurses rushed to the blood warmer. Evans' hands flew across his console, titrating pressors, pushing fluids. The entire resuscitation effort, which had been futile against the massive bleed, now had a chance. The patient was no longer a leaking bucket. And in the center of it all, Dr. Julian Croft stood completely still. His hands, which had just been guided like a resident's, held the life-saving catheter in place. He stared at the monitor, where the blood pressure was now reading 60/35 and climbing. He looked down into the now visible surgical field, where the catastrophic bleeding had simply stopped. Finally, he lifted his head and looked across the table at Anya Sharma. The timid, invisible new nurse was gone. In her place stood a woman of absolute, unshakable authority. Her mask covered her mouth, but her eyes, dark and intelligent, held his. There was no triumph in them, no "I told you so." There was only focus. The patient. The next step. She saw him looking, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the operative site. "The tamponade is temporary, doctor. It's bought you time. You have a stable field now. You can place your sutures." She wasn't asking. She was telling him the way forward. She had not only saved the patient, she was now directing the conclusion of the surgery. Croft felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a medical student, a profound, humbling, and utterly disorienting wave of respect for someone he had completely underestimated. He had seen the pinnacle of surgical technology fail. He had seen his own celebrated skills become useless. And then he had watched a $20 Foley catheter, wielded by the mind of a combat nurse he wouldn't have recognized in the hallway, do the impossible. The OR's rigid hierarchy had not just been shattered, it had been vaporized. He finally broke the silence, his own voice sounding foreign in his ears, stripped of its usual booming arrogance, quiet and raw. "Right," he said, looking at Anya, but speaking to the room. To his team. To the new order of things. "Give me a 4-0 Prolane. Let's fix this aorta." The clang of the discarded instrument still echoed in the profound silence that followed Croft's command. It was a vacuum, a void left behind by the departed hurricane of alarms and panicked shouting. All that remained was the metronomic, impossibly steady beep of the cardiac monitor, each pulse a testament to the miracle that had just unfolded. The green line, which moments before had been a flat, damning horizon, now traced a perfect sinus rhythm. The arterial line's angry red wave, once a shallow, thready ripple, now pulsed with a healthy, rounded peak. Dr. Croft worked with a focus that was purely mechanical. His hands, guided by decades of muscle memory, moved with practiced efficiency, weaving the 4-0 Prolane suture through the edges of the aortic tear. But his mind was 1,000 miles away, replaying the last 5 minutes in a disorienting loop. He had been the master of this universe, the conductor of this intricate symphony of life and death. Now, he felt like a first-year resident, his hands being guided by a force he couldn't comprehend. Every so often, his eyes would flick from the glistening, repaired tissue up to Nurse Anya Sharma. She wasn't looking at him. Her attention was fixed on the patient and the monitors, her posture unchanged from the quiet observer she had been all morning. Yet, everything about her was different. The timid aura had been replaced by a core of solid steel. She was a fixed point in a world that had just spun off its axis. It was Dr. Evans, the anesthesiologist, who gave the miracle its voice. He sat behind his wall of screens, his face illuminated by the glow of data. He'd been the one managing the pharmacological chaos, pushing epinephrine and vasopressors, transfusing blood product after product, watching the numbers slide inexorably towards zero. He unmuted his microphone, his voice a low, gravelly sound of pure awe that filled the room. "Blood pressure is 110/70, he announced, his gaze locked on Anya. "Holding steady. Central venous pressure is up to 8. We're getting good perfusion. SATs are 99% on 40% VO2. He took a breath, shaking his head slightly. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen people bleed out from less. I was about to start logging the final meds for the code summary." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Sharma, I don't know where you pulled that from, but you just resurrected the dead." The validation was clinical, empirical, and undeniable. It hung in the air, more potent than any compliment. Around the room, the spell of shock began to break. Maria, the scrub nurse who had worked with Croft for a decade, slowly turned her head. She had seen Croft's temper, his brilliance, his unshakable ego. She had never seen him silenced. She met Anya's eyes for a fleeting second and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of profound, sisterly respect, an acknowledgement of a barrier broken. Ben, the circulating nurse who had fetched the Foley catheter as if on a holy quest, leaned against the supply cabinet, his gloved hands braced on the steel. He mouthed the words "holy shit" to a junior resident cowering by the door. Up in the glass-walled observation gallery, the medical students were whispering frantically. They had come to watch the god of cardiothoracic surgery perform. They had expected a masterclass in conventional brilliance, a display of technique that would be written about in journals. Instead, they had witnessed something primal, something that would never appear in a textbook. They had seen dogma shattered by ingenuity. The lesson they learned today wasn't about surgical technique, it was about the fallibility of gods and the hidden power of the unassuming. Through it all, Anya remained a pillar of professional calm. She didn't acknowledge the praise or the stunned looks. Her validation was the rhythmic beep of the monitor. Her triumph was the pinking color of the patient's nail beds. Her mind had already moved on to the next 10 steps. "He's still hypothermic," she said, her voice even and clear, directed at Ben. "Let's get another fluid warmer going and place the bear hugger." She then turned to Dr. Evans. "He's received 12 units of packed red cells. We need to watch for coagulopathy. Have you sent a TEG and a fibrinogen level?" Her focus was so absolute, so relentlessly patient-centric, that it was almost jarring. She wasn't basking in the glory, she was already preventing the next potential complication. It was this, more than the procedure itself, that truly staggered Croft. The Foley was an act of brilliance born of desperation. This calm, forward-thinking command of the patient's entire physiology was the mark of a true master. The question finally surfaced, whispered from the gallery but felt by everyone in the room: who is she? Ben, spurred by the same thought, had slipped over to the OR's computer terminal. He typed in Anya's name, his brow furrowed. The initial screen was unremarkable: Anya Sharma, RN, BSN. Hired 3 months ago. Standard certifications. He clicked a tab for attached documents, for a resume that had been scanned into the system. It took a moment to load. As he read, his eyes widened. He walked back over to the anesthesia station, holding his phone as if he'd just looked something up, keeping his voice low but audible enough for those nearby. She was a captain, he murmured to Dr. Evans. Army Nurse Corps. Served 2 tours with a forward surgical team in Kandahar. The word spread through the room like a current. Forward surgical team. A MASH unit on the front lines. A place of controlled chaos, of catastrophic injury and impossible saves, where resources were scarce and ingenuity was the only currency that mattered. Suddenly, it all made sense. The unshakable calm in the face of death. The authority that had emerged from nowhere. The unorthodox, brutally effective solution. This wasn't her first hopeless situation. For her, this was just another Tuesday. Croft placed the final suture and looked up, the needle driver still in his hand. He had heard the whispers. Captain. Kandahar, the image of the quiet, deferential nurse he had dismissed all morning was incinerated, replaced by the image of a soldier, a leader, a woman forged in the crucible of war. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He didn't see a subordinate. He saw an equal. He saw someone who had faced down a kind of hell his pristine, multi-million-dollar operating room was designed to keep at bay, and she had won. The chaos in or one did not evaporate, it sublimated. The frantic energy of imminent death transformed into the focused, deliberate hum of recovery. The piercing alarms were silenced, replaced by the steady, metronomic pulse of the cardiac monitor, a rhythm that was the most beautiful sound in the world. The floor, once slick with saline and blood, was being meticulously cleaned. The surgical team, who minutes ago had been a frantic knot of failing hands, now moved with a renewed, almost reverent, purpose. They were closing. The patient, whose life had been measured in seconds, was stable. Dr. Julian Croft worked in a profound silence. His hands, which had trembled with frustration, were now steady as he threw the final skin sutures. Each pass of the needle was precise, mechanical, but his mind was miles away, replaying the last 30 minutes in a dizzying loop. The failure of the hemolock clips. The uselessness of the argon beam coagulator. The utter inadequacy of his multi-million-dollar toolkit against the primal, catastrophic bleed. And then, her voice. Get me a 24 French Foley catheter. Now, He hadn't just been given an order. His entire philosophy of medicine, a rigid structure built on technology, hierarchy, and his own deified talent, had been dismantled by a quiet nurse and a piece of urinary plumbing. The whispers had already started, spreading from the anesthesiologist to the circulating nurse, a current of awe and disbelief. Forward surgical team. Captain Sharma. Kandahar, the words were like fragments of a foreign language he was only just beginning to understand. This wasn't just a nurse who got lucky. This was a specialist whose expertise he hadn't even known existed. The consequence of his arrogance wasn't a reprimand from the board or a malpractice suit, it was a deep, seismic fracture in his own self-perception. He was the best, until he wasn't. Hours later, the hospital had settled into the quieter rhythm of the evening shift. The patient, no longer a collection of failing vitals but a man named Mr. Davies, was stable in the cricu. The Foley balloon, a temporary, life-saving plug, had held long enough for a vascular team to go back in, identify the aortic tear under controlled conditions, and place a definitive graft. The unorthodox save was now the stuff of hospital legend. Anya Sharma was finishing her charting at a nursing station, the adrenaline having long since faded, leaving behind the familiar ache of a long day on her feet. She had changed back into her standard-issue blue scrubs, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To anyone passing by, she was just another nurse. The transformation was internal. For the first time since leaving the army, she felt whole. The two halves of her life, the hardened combat medic and the diligent civilian nurse, were no longer in conflict. She had brought the battlefield to Prestige General, not with violence, but with its most valuable lesson: save the life, by any means necessary. Sharma. The voice was quiet, stripped of its usual booming authority. She looked up. Dr. Croft stood a few feet away, out of his surgical greens, dressed in tailored slacks and a crisp shirt. He looked smaller without the trappings of the ore. His hands were tucked into his pockets, a gesture of uncertainty she had never seen from him. "Dr. Croft," she replied, her tone neutral. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the hallway as if looking for an escape route from the conversation he had initiated. "Mr. Davies is extubated. Neurologically intact. His wife is with him." "That's good to hear," Anya said, her focus returning to the patient chart on the screen. She wasn't going to make this easy for him. She didn't want an apology born of embarrassment. If it came, it had to be born of understanding. He took a hesitant step closer. The chief of vascular called it the most audacious piece of surgical improvisation he'd ever seen. "They're writing it up for a journal." He paused, the unspoken part hanging in the sterile air between them. Asterisk, my name will be on it. But it wasn't my idea, asterisk. "Field medicine," Anya said simply, finally turning to look at him directly. "You don't have a vascular surgeon or a Dacron graft in a tent. You have what's in your pack. Sometimes, that's a Foley catheter." There it was. The chasm between their worlds, laid bare. His was a world of limitless resources, of scheduled perfection. Hers was a world of absolute scarcity, of finding the answer with nothing but your hands and your wits. Croft's gaze dropped to the floor, then met hers again. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, grudging respect. It wasn't an apology, not in words. It was something more profound. It was a concession. "You were right," he said, the 3 words costing him more than a 12-hour surgery ever could. "I was focused on the equipment. Not the problem." Anya gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It was enough. The problem was the patient was dying, doctor. That's always the only problem." He stood there for a moment longer, a titan of surgery unsteadied on his pedestal. He had built his kingdom on being the one with all the answers. Today, the most important answer had come from the person he had deemed least important in the room. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been inverted and remade. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement between peers, and walked away. Anya watched him go, then turned back to her work. She felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She didn't need the glory or the journal article. She didn't need to be called a hero. She just needed to be the person she was, a nurse, forged in the dust of Kandahar and tempered in the gleaming steel of Prestige General. Her expertise wasn't written on a diploma or a name badge, it was written in the steady pulse of the patient in the Kviku, a man who was alive because she had refused to let her past be silenced. In a world of hierarchies, she had proven that the most valuable skill is the one that saves a life, and that skill can come from anywhere, from anyone, at any time. All you have to do is be willing to listen. A week later, the overhead speakers blared to life. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 1. All available surgical staff to Trauma 1. Dr. Croft was already a blur of motion, his team scrambling to keep up. But then, in the middle of the chaotic corridor, he stopped. His head swiveled, scanning the faces until he saw her. Anya was at a nursing station, calmly preparing a medication tray. He didn't delegate. He didn't ask. He commanded, but his tone was different now, it was a summons for an equal. "Sharma," he bellowed across the hall. "With me. Now." Anya met his gaze, gave a sharp nod, and fell into step beside him as they ran. Her place was no longer in the background. This story shows that true expertise isn't defined by a title, but by action. Have you ever seen an unsung hero step up? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the hierarchy, and remember, The most important voice in the room is the one that saves a life.